On March 17, 2026, the price of Brent crude oil crossed $104 a barrel. Not because of a quarterly forecast, not because of a supply projection, because the most important maritime choke point on the planet had effectively shut down. Iran, under sustained military assault from the United States and Israel, had done what defense planners warned about for decades. It weaponized the Strait of Hormuz. And as drones and missiles rained down on oil terminals, gas fields, airports, and military bases across 5 separate Gulf nations, the President of the United States stood before cameras and called it a surprise. But it wasn't a surprise. And the distance between what he was told in private and what he said in public may turn out to be the defining scandal of this entire crisis. To understand how this unraveled so quickly, we need to go back to February 28th, 2026. That's the day the United States and Israel launched coordinated military strikes against Iran. The stated goals depended on who was doing the talking: neutralizing Iran's nuclear capabilities, degrading its military infrastructure, restoring deterrence across the region. But regardless of the framing, the consequences were immediate. Within 3 weeks, at least 2,000 people were dead across the Middle East. What was presented as a targeted operation had expanded into a multi-theater regional war that no official talking point had prepared the public for. Iran's response was neither impulsive nor chaotic. It was calculated, sequenced, and aimed at the single point where the West is most exposed: global energy supply. Tehran understood a basic strategic truth. It didn't need to match American military power on the battlefield. It needed to make this war so economically disruptive, so painful for Washington's regional partners, that the political equation would shift. And the instrument it chose was precision strikes on the energy infrastructure that keeps the global economy moving. The first and most devastating wave targeted the United Arab Emirates, specifically the port of Fujairah. Sitting on the Gulf of Oman, Fujairah was built for exactly this kind of moment. It was designed as a bypass, an alternative export terminal that could keep oil flowing even if the Strait of Hormuz was blocked. For years, energy planners pointed to Fujairah as proof that the Gulf states had a contingency plan. Iran destroyed that contingency in the space of a single month, hitting the port with 3 separate drone strikes. Oil loading operations ground to a halt. An advanced fire broke out at the terminal, and just like that, the backup plan was gone. What came next revealed the full scope of Iran's campaign and how little anyone had prepared for it. A drone strike on the Shah gas field, one of the UAE's most critical natural gas facilities, ignited a fire severe enough to force a complete suspension of operations. This is a facility capable of processing 1.28 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day, a cornerstone of the UAE's energy output. With a single strike, it went offline. Hours later, Dubai International Airport, one of the busiest aviation hubs on the planet, a symbol of the Gulf's openness and global connectivity, shut down over airspace security concerns. Commercial flights were grounded. For a nation that has built its entire brand around being safe, modern, and open for global business, the impact cut deeper than any warhead. And the UAE wasn't alone. Iran launched simultaneous or near simultaneous strikes across Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait. American military bases across the Gulf took direct fire. An Emirati base hosting French troops was hit, pulling a European NATO member's personnel into a conflict that European capitals had explicitly refused to join. In Baghdad, drones struck near the U.S. Embassy compound and impacted the upper perimeter of a nearby hotel. The geographic breadth of these operations was staggering. This wasn't a symbolic response or a face-saving gesture. It was a full-spectrum regional campaign executed with operational precision. When you look at the targeting pattern as a whole, the strategic logic becomes impossible to miss. By striking Fujairah, and threatening the Strait of Hormuz simultaneously. Iran eliminated both the primary shipping route and its most important alternative. Roughly 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas transits the Strait of Hormuz on any given day. That's not an abstract number. It represents the physical flow of energy that powers manufacturing in East Asia, heats homes across Europe, and fuels transportation networks on every continent. When that flow stops, the effects don't stay contained to the Persian Gulf. They cascade through every interconnected economy on Earth. And that cascade began almost immediately. ICE Brent crude surged to $104.84 per barrel. U.S. West Texas Intermediate hit $99.32. These weren't gradual increases driven by nervous market speculation. They were sharp, violent price spikes triggered by the physical inability to move oil through its most critical transit point. Previous weeks of market losses were reversed in a matter of hours. For energy-dependent economies, which is to say virtually every major economy on the planet, the consequences landed fast and hard. Shipping costs for Gulf route tankers exploded. Insurance premiums followed close behind. Refineries in South Korea, Japan, India, and across Europe scrambled for alternative crude sources, driving prices up even further as everyone chased the same limited supply. And perhaps most critically, there was no credible timeline for when normal shipping operations might resume. No multinational force was assembling to reopen the strait. No naval plan existed to clear the mines Iran had distributed across the shipping lanes. Markets weren't just reacting to a disruption. They were pricing in the possibility that this disruption could stretch on for months. If the military and economic dimensions of this crisis are alarming, the political dimension might be more damaging still. Because what happened behind closed doors in Washington tells a story that directly contradicts the narrative being constructed in public. And the implications of that contradiction extend far beyond this one conflict. Facing a growing wave of criticism over the escalation and its consequences for American allies, President Trump publicly described Iran's attacks on Gulf states as something no one anticipated. His exact words, "Nobody expected that. We were shocked." It was a carefully crafted statement designed to cast Iran as an irrational, unpredictable adversary and to deflect responsibility for the regional firestorm that followed the initial strikes. There was just one problem with that framing. Multiple U.S. officials speaking to Reuters confirmed it wasn't true. Intelligence agencies had briefed the president before the strikes on Iran that retaliation against Gulf allies was not merely possible, it was likely. Those briefings reportedly laid out the scenario in explicit terms. Attacking Iran could trigger a broader regional conflict, including direct strikes on Gulf capitals and energy infrastructure. These weren't fringe assessments buried in classified appendices. They were core conclusions presented to the commander-in-chief as part of the decision-making process. He heard the warnings. He authorized the strikes. And then he told the American public that the predictable consequences were a shock. If that disconnect between intelligence and public messaging is reshaping how you see this crisis, drop your perspective in the comments, because the gap between what leaders know and what they tell the public is where the most important accountability questions live. And those questions deserve a much wider conversation. Once allied governments, the ones whose cities and military bases were now under Iranian fire, saw the American president misrepresenting what he had been told, the trust that underpins military alliances started fracturing in real time. And what followed made the fracture visible to the entire world. Trump demanded that allied nations deploy warships to secure the Strait of Hormuz. He pointed specifically at China, claiming that 90% of its crude oil imports transit the strait. And he expressed open public frustration with European governments for declining to contribute naval forces. His rhetoric was aggressive and transactional, essentially telling partners that if they benefit from Gulf oil, they owe military service in return. The response from those partners was almost uniformly cold. Germany was the most direct. Chancellor Friedrich Merz stated plainly that Berlin had no mandate to deploy warships and, in a remark that cut straight to the core of the alliance breakdown, noted that Germany was never consulted before the United States and Israel launched the war. Spain and Italy struck similar notes. No ships, no timeline, no commitments. Yet the refusal from European allies wasn't even the most revealing development. That distinction belongs to the U.S. Navy itself. American shipping companies, tanker operators, logistics firms, energy transporters had been making near-daily requests for naval escorts through the Strait of Hormuz, standard practice in a contested waterway, the kind of protection that the world's most powerful navy has provided in previous Gulf crises, going back to the 1980s. And the Navy said no, repeatedly. The stated reason was blunt. The risk of attack was too severe. Consider what that sequence actually means. The United States launched a war that it knew would provoke attacks on the world's most critical shipping lane. Its own Navy then determined that the lane was too dangerous to operate in. And the president's response was to demand that other countries' navies go in their place. When your own military won't do what you're asking allies to do, the credibility of the request disintegrates. This is the kind of fracture that doesn't heal between news cycles. Alliance relationships are built on decades of shared risk, mutual consultation, and the foundational expectation that one partner won't unilaterally create a crisis and then distribute the costs. What happened in March 2026 violated all of those principles simultaneously. Governments across Europe, Asia, and the Gulf are recalibrating, not just for this crisis, but for every future scenario in which Washington might call for coalition support. Trump's demand that China help secure the strait rested on a superficially logical argument. Beijing depends on Gulf oil, so Beijing should help protect Gulf shipping. But that argument ignores 20 years of deliberate Chinese strategic planning. Beijing watched previous Gulf crises unfold, the tanker war of the 1980s, the disruptions following the 2003 Iraq invasion, the 2019 drone strikes on Saudi Aramco, and drew a conclusion that now looks prescient. Never let your energy security depend on a single choke point controlled by someone else's military. So China diversified. Pipelines through Central Asia and Myanmar, massive investment in Russian energy partnerships, strategic petroleum reserves built at a scale that dwarfs most Western equivalents. When the Strait of Hormuz effectively closed, China was better positioned to absorb the shock than almost any other major oil importer. Not painlessly, no nation is fully insulated from a disruption this severe, but with enough resilience to avoid the kind of emergency that would force a military response. The notion that Beijing would send warships to protect a shipping lane disrupted by a war it didn't start, didn't endorse, and gains nothing from was never a realistic expectation. And China's silence in the face of Trump's demands said everything that needed to be said. If you've been following this conflict and want to stay ahead of the next developments, subscribe now. The strategic landscape is shifting week by week, and the decisions being made this month will reverberate for years. While major powers maneuvered and traded accusations, a parallel story was developing that could shape the next phase of this conflict in concrete operational terms. The United Kingdom reportedly began considering the deployment of specialized mine-hunting drones from the Royal Navy's Mine and Threat Exploitation Group. Their mission? Locating and neutralizing the naval mines Iran had seeded across key shipping lanes in and around the strait. If successful, it could reopen at least partial commercial shipping capacity, a critical first step toward easing the energy chokehold. London was also evaluating interceptor drone systems designed to counter Iran's Shahed series unmanned aerial vehicles, the same low-cost platform responsible for the strikes on Fujairah, the Shah gas field, and targets across the Gulf. Shahed drones are cheap to produce, easy to deploy in large numbers, and have proven devastatingly effective against fixed infrastructure. Developing reliable, scalable countermeasures has moved from a research priority to an operational necessity overnight. For the defense industry more broadly, this crisis has compressed procurement timelines that normally stretch over years into a matter of weeks. Gulf states, particularly the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain, are expected to fast-track acquisitions of localized air defense systems, counter-UAV platforms, and autonomous mine clearance technology. Demand for these systems was growing before February 2026. Under the pressure of active combat and demonstrated vulnerability, it has become urgent in a way that peacetime procurement processes were never designed to handle. Even the most advanced defense technology, however, cannot address the structural vulnerability this crisis has exposed. The Strait of Hormuz has always been the global energy system's most dangerous single point of failure. And the assumption that kept it functioning, that no rational actor would actually close it, has been decisively broken. That assumption rested on straightforward logic. Iran's own economy depends heavily on oil exports. Closing the strait would devastate Iranian revenue as surely as it would disrupt global supply. Therefore, no Iranian government would accept that degree of self-inflicted damage. For years, the calculation held. But it held under conditions that no longer exist. When a nation's nuclear facilities are being destroyed, when its military infrastructure is under sustained bombardment, when its sovereignty faces an existential threat, the economic costs of closing the strait start to look different. They start to look like the least destructive option available. They start to look like the only leverage Tehran has left. And that is precisely how Iran has used them. Commercial operators across the Gulf are already feeling the consequences. Multinational corporations in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain have activated emergency evacuation and asset protection protocols, plans that existed as theoretical documents in risk management binders and are now being executed under live combat conditions. Energy executives face an immediate imperative to hedge their exposure to Gulf-sourced crude and LNG. With the U.S. Navy unwilling to escort commercial vessels, the supply disruption has no clear resolution mechanism, and waiting passively for one invites catastrophic financial exposure. Logistics firms face a parallel crisis with no easy solution. Rerouting supply chains away from the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf of Oman isn't simply a matter of choosing a different line on a map. The Cape of Good Hope route around southern Africa adds weeks to transit times and massively inflates fuel costs. Pipeline alternatives through Saudi Arabia have limited throughput and carry their own security risks, given the ongoing strikes across the kingdom. Infrastructure capable of absorbing the volume of trade that normally passes through Hormuz doesn't exist elsewhere at the required scale. Every day the strait stays closed, the economic damage compounds, and the recovery timeline extends further into an uncertain future. If someone you know needs to understand the full scope of what's happening in the Gulf, not the headline version, but the strategic reality, share this with them. The decisions being made right now will shape energy markets, alliance structures, and global security policy for years to come. And then there's the question that will outlast this conflict, possibly by decades. Who knew what, when they knew it, and what they chose to tell the public? Because the intelligence disconnect at the heart of this crisis is not merely a political embarrassment. It represents a structural failure in how a democracy communicates risk when the consequences are measured in lives and global economic stability. American intelligence agencies, by all available reporting, did their job. They assessed the risks. They identified the likely consequences. They presented those conclusions to the president. The decision to proceed with strikes, despite the warnings, was a policy choice. And in a democracy, elected leaders have the authority to make difficult choices, even when the risks are severe. But that authority does not extend to publicly misrepresenting what they were told. When the president described a predicted outcome as an unexpected shock, he opened a credibility gap that damages not just his administration's standing, but the broader framework of trust that holds alliances together and allows markets to function with some degree of confidence. Congressional committees have already signaled that investigations are forthcoming. Two questions are likely to dominate. First, was the decision to strike Iran made with a full and honest accounting of the probable consequences, including the risk to allied nations who weren't consulted? And second, was the president's public characterization of those consequences as unforeseen a deliberate misrepresentation? If so, what was the motive? And what does it mean for democratic accountability in wartime? These questions tend to generate their own momentum once the investigative machinery starts turning, and the answers could reshape the political landscape well beyond the current crisis. What this month has revealed is something larger than any single policy failure or intelligence briefing. It has exposed the fragility of assumptions that the entire global order has been built on. Assumptions about the stability of energy choke points, the durability of alliance commitments, the rationality of deterrence, and the honesty of democratic leadership in moments of crisis. Every one of those assumptions has been tested in the space of 3 weeks. Every one has shown fractures. Some may be repairable. Others could prove to be permanent structural failures that force a fundamental rethinking of how nations manage collective risk and shared security. What we are watching unfold is not simply a military conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran. It is a simultaneous stress test on the global energy system, the transatlantic alliance, the credibility of American strategic leadership, and the unwritten rules that have governed behavior in the Persian Gulf for half a century. Iran's retaliation was predicted. The alliance fractures were foreseeable. The energy market shock was modeled in war game scenarios stretching back 20 years. And yet, when the moment arrived, the response was defined by hesitation, blame shifting, and a public narrative that contradicted the private intelligence. The question now is not whether this crisis will reshape the geopolitical order. It already has. The question is whether anyone involved possesses the strategic clarity and political courage to prevent the next phase from being worse than the last. Because every signal coming out of the Gulf, out of Washington, and out of the Allied capitals that refused to send their ships points in one direction. The window to change course is still open, but it is closing, and it is closing fast.